What's up, guys? It's the Lazy Goldmaker here. We're back with another video and another case study video. And this time we're tackling what used to be the creme de la creme of gold making. For those of you who played the BFA and Legion or followed me during that time period, you might be able to guess what I'm going to be focusing on. Is going to be BoE flipping, of course. This was very, very profitable in both BFA and Legion. There was some absolutely bonkers sales at the time, but yeah, I made so much gold throughout BFA and throughout Legion with these markets. That's the main reason why I even established myself on multiple realms to do this specific market. Yeah, let's take a look at why it was so absolutely fantastic. So, some flipping basics. Flipping generally works best when there is a large discrepancy between supply and demand, or how supply and demand looks. Now, this is mostly relevant, actually, for stuff like materials, where there's always a significant volume, and then people will buy out a lot of that volume on, say, the weekend or midweek, preparing for raid or whatever. And stuff varies over time. The number of items posted to the auction house varies over time. The number of items bought will vary over time. And that's why those markets work. Now, for gear flipping, it's a little bit different. And for BoEs, it has been different in the past. And now it's more looking at the discrepancy between supply and demand. It's actually more how it functions in Shadowlands. But how it used to function is that it was more akin to what you would call arbitrage from finance. And what that means is that you're taking advantage of differences in prices between different markets. So let's say if a stock was selling for or being traded for $10 on one stock exchange, and then another stock exchange had the same stock trading for $12, then you'd buy a ton of that stock on the cheap exchange and move it to the other exchange, and then you'd make a lot of gold, completely riskless. And it's the same thing that you're sort of doing with BoE flipping, because there aren't that many BoEs available. So what you can see with BoEs is you can see what players are willing to sell them for. But in many cases in the past, like there's maybe been only one or two of that specific BoE available for sale. And when there's a lot of items available for sale, then the current market price is probably what people are actually willing to pay, because it's going to stabilize to that point, to whatever people are willing to buy a significant chunk of it for. But that doesn't hold true for items, for one-off items. So if there's very few items on the auction house, then you can only know what people are willing to sell them for. Which means if you have a better idea about what people might be willing to pay for this item, then you can make a profit. Then you can take advantage of this price discrepancy, of this arbitrage, of the fact that people don't necessarily know how much people are willing to pay. It was the same thing we had when rank 5 legendaries came out. Like, how much should you post them for? I don't know. I don't know what people are willing to pay. For those, people started really high. It went down very quickly because it was something that could be mass produced. But that you can't do that with BoEs. So if the price is low enough relative to what you know or guess or think players might be willing to pay, then you can take advantage of it. And this happened so much in BFA and Legion. Why was that? It was because of our good friends, Mr. Warforging. The Warforging system, which meant that every item, every epic item, every item in the game actually, when it dropped, it had a base item level, based on the raid difficulty for stuff that dropped from raid. Like, it was started at X item level if it was the LFR, and then whatever 15 higher for normal and heroic and all that jazz. But once it dropped, they rolled the dice. They didn't roll a dice, but they ran the RNG, and they could add some amount of extra item level, 5, 10, 15. And what this meant was there was just an absolutely incredible number of different item variants, including the fact that you could have multiple, like 3, potentially even 4 different BoEs in terms of their item ID and how they look in the database, and thus how they look on the auction house at the exact same item level, which means that they were for functional reasons, in terms of equipping them to your character, they were the exact same item. But any auction house add-on would not see them as the same item. The base auction house UI would not see them as the same item. Then on top of that, you obviously also had tertiary stats and sockets, but which added another layer of variation, which means that, okay, so maybe you managed to figure out that the item level 420 BOEs are selling for 60k or 500k or whatever, but then you don't notice that your one has a socket and can be sold for 100k more, because that's how much people were willing to pay for a socket. So the sum total of all this was that in most cases, your item would be the only one of that exact type in terms of base item, extra bonus rolls, etc. on your realm. So you had to come up with the price yourself. And we didn't have the new auction house UI either, so you couldn't see the full auction house for your base item either, which made it even harder. So what does that mean? It meant that people who were selling their BOEs as one-offs, they mispriced them quite often. Which meant that it was very, very easy. Every time I ran a shopping scan for BOEs on every one of my realms, I could find at least 1 to 3 BOEs that I was willing to buy, because they seemed underpriced relative to the auction house and the realm. So that's what I did. Now, this was also compounded. I started with this in Legion, and in Legion we also had item level 1, or not item level, required level 101 BOEs. Because you could make a level 101 Twink, smash it full of World Drop BOEs with a lot of leech, and you would reach unkillable god status due to how secondary stat scaling worked, where you get a lot more power from secondary stats at a lower level, including leech, which was hilarious. You could have people were having demon hunters with a ton of mastery, which gave them movement speed, so they were running as fast as a mount, just running, and they would self-heal and could like mass pull, do huge AoE pulls in dungeons, and solo them easily, and not ever be in danger. They could beat max level characters in world PvP. It was also a lot of fun to play. I made a Demon Hunter Twink eventually, but it was also incredibly profitable to flip these BOEs. And for the 101 BOEs, you were always on the lookout for pieces with leech. If it had leech, then it was usually worth 100 to 200k more than any item of the same type and item level, because leech was so good for these twinks. Now, this was already really good. Then eventually in BFA, in the last patch, they removed Warforging, because they didn't want RNG on gear. And then they added the most ludicrous amount of variance in power to gear that they've ever added with Corruption. And Corruption was this was a godsend for those of us doing BOE flipping, let me tell you. So Corruptions worked, they were a random roll on top of your item. There were a bunch of different Corruptions. I don't know exactly how many, I don't remember. 15 different Corruptions, and each of them had multiple ranks. Which meant that you had maybe as many as 40 different Corruptions that an item could have. And they could spawn randomly on any BOE. So for the heroic leather, whatever, bracers or whatever they were in that patch, you could have 40 different variants of that. And some of those would be absolute bis due to how incredibly strong the corruption effect was. And some of them would be like, whatever, nobody cares about them. So imagine trying to price your items correctly in that scenario. It was impossible, even with the new auction house, because you could just see what the items at the same item level were priced at. That was the default behavior. But item level didn't really matter. The corruption effect mattered. Did it have a max rank Twilight Devastation on a tank piece? Oh yeah, that's money in the bank. Did it have a max rank Infinite Stars when that was super overpowered? Okay, yeah, you'd literally sell that for 500k more, 700k, potentially even 1 million more than a comparable item with another corruption effect. It was absolute pandemonium. And it was so good. It was so good because people could not figure out how much their items were worth. It was impossible. Unless you had multiple auction house add-ons and paid attention to the market. I pretty much just focused on using the region market value average. I would compare the item. Okay, how much cheaper is this than the region market price? Okay, it's a lot cheaper. Yeah, I'll buy it. It's not a lot cheaper. Okay, maybe I'll buy it if it's a really good corruption, because I know that I can take a smaller profit margin there. And yeah, it was hilarious. You'll see some of the prices have been popping up on screen, and like I sold some of the most expensive items I've ever sold were sold in that era, and it was so good. Now we're in Shadowlands, and I haven't done any BoE. I've done some BoE flipping, but I haven't really made gold with it. Why is that? Well, they removed most of the RNG from the gear system in terms of a mythic BoE is now a mythic BoE. It's item level 252 in Sanctum of Domination, and that's it. It can roll a socket or avoidance or speed or leech, and that's going to increase the value a little bit. But the marginal benefit of any of these things, like 16 extra secondary stats or slightly make you tank slightly more damage with avoidance and all that jazz, is a very, very small effect. Very, very small, which means that people are not willing to pay that much extra for it. And it also means that it's much easier to price your items. You have a mythic BoE, you go to your auction house, every other mythic BoE is going to be there of the same type. And even if you have the only one with the socket, there's a chance you misprice that one. But for the most part, you're going to be pricing your item relatively correctly just by using the base auction house and slamming it out at the current price. And that's why it's very hard to make gold there. You can find deals every once in a while. You'll find some deals related to sockets, related to tertiary stats that people might undervalue, and some buyers are going to overvalue or value more. And I've made a little bit of gold. But overall, in BFA and Legion, when I was running shopping scans, I would find 1 to 4, 5 BOEs on every one of my realms every time I ran a shopping scan. In Shadowlands, I run a shopping scan. I usually don't get a single deal. So I've stopped running them because there's no point. Because now it's easy to price your BOEs correctly. And the only way you could now maybe take advantage of it is if there were some supply-demand shenanigans going on, like say what happens to old world materials where someone is buying a ton of them, but that doesn't really happen with BOEs. You buy one if you need one, and if you farm one, then you go post it right away. There's a little bit of that, of like probably more people farming on specific days of the week, but it's not really going to impact the market enough to where you can consistently exploit that sort of price of mispricing. So that's it. That's why BoE flipping isn't as good anymore. And that's it for this video. So hopefully this was interesting to you. This is a trip down memory lane, like BoE flipping in Shadowlands, not in Shadowlands, in BFA and Legion. It's the most fun I've ever had in gold making. So I hope that, on that note, I hope that they bring back Warforging or RNG to gearing. But from the perspective of me actually raiding and playing the endgame, I'm really happy that they don't have it in the game, because it would be really annoying. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it. Leave a like, leave a comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. We'll see you on the next video. Goodbye, guys. Boom.